"You're going to stay with us tonight," said the three Chinese women already living on the farm the mountain man bought. The girl was cold, bleeding, and alone when she knocked on the cabin door. She thought the man would turn her away, but the women said otherwise, and he listened. They spoke with quiet authority, like they'd lived through storms she hadn't yet imagined. Why did they speak for him? Why did he obey? And what had happened on that mountain before they came, before she came, that turned a cabin in the woods into the safest place she'd ever known? When a door opens in the dead of winter and strangers become something more, the real question isn't who let her in, but why they stayed. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like these still matter. If you believe in second chances, quiet strength, and standing up for what's right, then you belong here. Let me know which state you're watching from, and subscribe so we can keep bringing these powerful frontier tales to life. The slap came quick, a backhand of rage and shame, and Leon hit the frozen earth hard. Her lips split, her elbow scraped raw on gravel, but she didn't cry. Not yet. The foreman stood over her, his breath steaming in the dawn air, eyes hard with fury that she had dared say no. She was nothing to him, a cook's daughter, bought passage with her hands and silence. She had given both, but not that. He spat beside her, and with a grunt, waved the other men away. "She's out. Don't let her back in," he barked, as though she were a stray mutt nosing around his tent. The others looked away. One man, Mr. Zhang, older, with trembling hands, started to speak, but the foreman's glare silenced him. No one helped her up. No one offered a coat. Only the hiss of the wind and the creak of pine branches answered her as she rose, trembling, and turned toward the tree line. She walked without thinking, just away. Her thin shoes crunched over snow and needles, her breath shallow with pain and disbelief. The camp faded behind her, just smoke and hammering and the smell of salt pork. She would not go back. She could not. The woods loomed, thick and vast, and the cold bit through her sleeves like claws. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then began to fall again. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she had nothing. No food, no water, no compass. Her feet stung, then went numb. She wrapped her arms around herself and kept moving. A shadow passed overhead, an eagle or hawk, and once she thought she heard voices, but it was only wind slicing through bare trees. As dusk bled into a gray-blue twilight, snow began to fall, fat, heavy flakes that soaked her hair and clung to her lashes. Her teeth chattered now. Her fingers had gone stiff. A branch snapped behind her. She turned sharply. Nothing but white and shadows. Another snap, closer this time. She saw them. 3 of them, eyes glinting like coins in the fading light. Wolves. They made no sound, only watched, low to the ground, their breath curling like smoke. One moved, slow and deliberate, testing her fear. She stepped back, heart slamming. Then she ran. The trees blurred. Her legs were lead, but terror gave her strength. The wolves loped behind her, not yet chasing, stalking. She tripped, caught herself, kept running. Branches slapped her face. Blood ran down her chin, but she didn't stop. Her breath rasped in her throat like broken glass. Then, through the trees, light, faint, golden, flickering. A cabin, smoke rising from the chimney. She stumbled toward it, half falling, limbs shaking. The wolves had stopped. She didn't look back. She reached the steps, collapsed against the door, pounded once with her good hand. Then again. Her voice came out broken. "Help. Please. Help." Inside, footsteps. Then silence. She waited, slumped, barely conscious. Then the door creaked open. A towering man stood in the doorway. Gray-streaked beard, eyes sharp and wild. He said nothing. Behind him, 3 women watched, calm as still water. The man's voice was gravel. "You'll freeze out here." But the voice that answered wasn't his. "She's going to stay with us tonight," said one of the women, and the door opened wider. Snow clung to Leon's shoulders like a burial shroud as she stood swaying at the threshold. The door loomed before her, tall and worn, its grain darkened by years of wind and rain. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her knees buckled once, then again, until she dropped to them. Her hands pressed against the wood like it was the last solid thing in the world. She didn't know where she was, only that the trees had parted, and this cabin had appeared like a mirage. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. Warmth was somewhere inside. She knocked once, then again, then let her forehead rest against the door. Her lips were blue, her eyes barely open. From within, heavy footsteps stirred, not hurried, not alarmed, just steady. A pause, then the bolt slid back with the grind of metal on wood. The door opened. He filled the frame like a shadow cut from iron. A bear of a man, tall and broad, with a thick beard shot through with gray. His coat was rough buffalo hide, stitched by hand, the buttons mismatched. His eyes were dark and unreadable beneath his fur-lined hat. His boots were cracked with old snow and ash. He didn't speak at first, just looked down at her, head tilted, as if deciding whether she was real or another ghost brought in by the storm. She didn't speak either. Couldn't. Her voice had dried to ash in her throat. Her hands trembled on the threshold. Her legs had given up. "You'll freeze out here," the man said finally, voice deep and level, like earth shifting beneath stone. He stepped aside. Inside, the light flickered from a cast-iron stove, its fire dancing golden across the log walls. The scent of burning cedar filled the air, sweet and sharp. 3 women stood in the background, each distinct, each still. One, older, with streaks of silver in her braided hair. Another, younger, silent, eyes watchful and calm. The third, taller than the rest, with strong arms and an expression like carved granite. They did not rush to her. They simply waited. Leon crossed the threshold, or rather, fell across it. The older woman moved first, placing a folded blanket on the floor beside her. No words, just hands, gentle, swift, practiced. She checked Leon's fingers, her pulse. She touched her cheek, felt the fever rising beneath the skin. "Get the hot water," she said quietly. The younger woman moved without a sound. The man said nothing. He closed the door behind her, slow and deliberate, then bolted it with one heavy hand. He turned toward the stove, pulled a chair closer, and sat. For a moment, he stared into the flames. Then he glanced back once, just once, at the girl who now lay curled on his floor like a wind-blown leaf. "Won't be safe come night," he muttered, but the tall woman shook her head. "She's going to stay with us tonight," she said again. And this time, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. He gave a short nod, said nothing more. The wind howled outside the walls, clawing at the roof and windows, but the fire inside burned warm. The women tended to the girl, and the man, silent and still, watched the storm begin to pass. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around Leon like a blanket woven from breath itself. Her fingers ached as the feeling returned, like needles beneath her skin. Her clothes were damp, her lips cracked, but she no longer trembled. She lay on a cot near the stove, wrapped in wool and silence, staring at the ceiling beams above her. The fire hissed softly in the corner, casting long shadows that swayed gently across the room. She wasn't alone. The 3 women moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, like a river flowing around stones. They did not speak much, only when needed. The eldest of the 3, May, wore her long hair in a tight braid that glinted silver in the firelight. Her hands were stained by earth and herbs, and her eyes held the steady calm of someone who had once knelt beside too many sickbeds. She pressed a warm mug into Leon's hands, a tea that smelled of ginger and something bitter, and said, "Drink this slowly. It will help the pain in your chest." Leon sipped, wincing. It burned going down but spread warmth through her ribs. May touched her cheek gently. "You're safe here." Lynn, the quiet one, said nothing at all. She moved with the grace of a shadow, barefoot and silent, her steps barely making the floor creak. She brought dry clothes, clean linens, and a basin of hot water. Her eyes met Leon's only once, dark eyes, full of questions, and something like understanding. Then she looked away and continued her work, wringing out cloths, folding, placing. The third woman, Bao, stood near the door. Taller than the others, with broad shoulders and a thick scar that disappeared beneath her collar, she watched Leon like a hawk watches the tree line, alert, coiled, ready. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. Leon's voice was still faint. You live here?" Bao's answer came flat, steady. "We do." "All of you?" Bao nodded. "Together." May knelt beside her, pressing a damp cloth to Leon's forehead. "This place was empty when he found it," she said quietly. "He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't turn us out." Leon glanced toward the man, Elijah, though she didn't yet know his name. He sat by the fire, carving something from a block of wood. His eyes flicked to her once, then back to the knife in his hand. "He doesn't talk much," May added, "but he listens, and he keeps wolves away, the two-legged kind too." Leon blinked, confused. May didn't explain. Lynn placed a folded bundle at the foot of the cot, a stitched quilt with birds in flight across it. Her work. Elijah stood, his chair scraping the floor. He walked over with the weight of a tree bending in a storm. He didn't crouch or kneel, just looked down at her, his face unreadable. "You'll stay with them," he said simply. Then he turned and walked out into the dark, pulling the door closed behind him. No one spoke for a moment. The fire cracked. Leon's fingers curled around the cup, the taste of the tea still lingering on her tongue. She looked at May, then Lynn, then Bao. "You're not afraid of him?" Bao answered. "We were. Once." And for the first time since entering the cabin, Bao's expression softened. Just slightly. Enough to show that whatever had come before, whatever pain they had known, they were still standing. Together. Leon lay back, letting the quilt rest over her like a second skin. Outside, snow whispered against the windows, but inside the silence was no longer empty. It was full of stories not yet spoken, full of names carried like wounds, full of lives stitched back together, one quiet day at a time. The days passed slowly, like mist lifting off the morning fields. Leon woke to the smell of boiled roots and wood smoke, to the creak of floorboards under practiced feet, and to the hush of voices that never rose above the fire's crackle. Her body healed in inches. The bruises faded, the fever broke, but the other wounds, the ones buried deep, remained untouched, waiting. She didn't cry. She never had. Not when her mother vanished in the flood, not when the foreman's hand struck her, not when she wandered half-dead through the pines. But here, in this place of quiet mercy, the tears came, not in fits, but in small, sudden waves, like spring water slipping from between rocks. May would sit beside her without speaking, grinding herbs in a bowl worn smooth with years of use. She'd hand Leon tinctures that tasted of bark and bitter honey, and wrap her hands in salves that smelled like pine needles. The body remembers, May said once, dabbing a bruise that ran the length of Leon's ribs. But memory doesn't have to own you, Lynn taught with her hands. She'd lay out simple tasks, folding cloth, mending seams, and wait for Leon to copy her. She never scolded, only nodded when the work was done. Sometimes, when the sun poured through the windows just right, Lynn would sew birds into scraps of fabric, always flying, never caged. Leon didn't ask why. She already knew. Bao taught her to carry water, to chop wood. The body needs work, she said, thrusting a dull hatchet into Leon's palm, or it forgets it belongs to you. Her tone was harsh, but her eyes held a kind of pride. She didn't help when Leon stumbled, didn't soften when the wood bit her knuckles. But when it was done, Bao handed her a tin cup of tea and nodded once. Still standing, she said. That was enough. Outside, the mountain man worked from dawn to dusk. Elijah, they called him when they thought she wasn't listening. He moved with the steady rhythm of someone long used to solitude, hauling feed, mending fences, stacking firewood in neat rows. He never raised his voice, never knocked twice. But every evening, without fail, Leon found her bucket filled before she touched it, her chores half finished before she began. A new pair of gloves appeared beside the door. A carved spoon rested on her cot. She never saw him leave them. He never entered the women's rooms, never crossed the invisible line they seemed to hold. But he was always near, watching, not with suspicion, but with a quiet vigilance, as though danger still hovered at the tree line, and he alone could keep it at bay. Once, as she passed the barn, she caught sight of him standing by the fence. A foal had been born, trembling on unsteady legs. Elijah knelt beside it, his massive hand stroking its flank. His face, rough and weathered, was gentler than she'd imagined. He murmured something she couldn't hear. The colt blinked, leaned into him. That night, as snow began to fall again, Leon stepped out onto the porch. She looked up at the stars and felt them watching her, cold and patient. Her hands were rough now. Her palms blistered, her shoulders sore. But she felt something inside her, something like breath after being held too long. A small warmth, not safety, not yet, but the idea of it. Behind her, the door creaked open. Elijah's voice came from the shadows. "Storm will pass quick," he said. She nodded, though he couldn't see her face. He didn't say anything more, just stood there for a while, long enough for her to feel the silence between them grow soft instead of sharp. And when he went back inside, Leon stayed a little longer, listening to the wind. Her fingers curled around the railing. She was still here, still standing. The thaw came slowly that year. Snow melted in reluctant patches, revealing muddy ground and broken twigs. The cabin roof still bore ice like a crown, but the wind had softened, no longer sharp enough to steal breath. Leon moved more freely now. Her limbs no longer protested every step, and the hollow ache in her belly had turned into something steadier, routine, purpose, the rhythm of rising, working, sleeping. But as the season shifted, something in the cabin's air changed with it. There was warmth now, and light through the windows, but also a strange stillness, like something buried beneath the floorboards had begun to stir. He never explained much. Elijah Crane. She heard May say his name one morning, quiet as prayer. The words had weight, like iron hammered on an anvil. Elijah Crane. It suited him, sharp-edged, unmovable, a man carved from the same stone as the mountain itself. He worked alone, always alone. The barn was his dominion, and no one crossed its threshold. Lynn once stepped too close with an armful of firewood and was met with a single word, out. Not shouted, not cruel, just final. She obeyed without hesitation. The rules weren't written down, but they settled over the homestead like law. No one went into the barn. No one brought strangers past the gate. No one asked about what came before, his or theirs. When Leon tried once, just once, to ask May why they followed those rules, the older woman shook her head gently. "We are guests here, and his ghosts are not ours to name." Bao didn't talk about it. She simply kept a watchful eye on the gate, axe always within reach. Lin said nothing, but Leon sometimes caught her glancing toward the barn window at night, when the wind rattled the shutters and something heavy shifted inside. There were nights when Elijah would leave after supper, wordless as always, and not return until long past dark. He carried no lantern, only a sack over his shoulder and that same old rifle slung across his back. Leon once watched him disappear into the trees, his silhouette swallowed by mist. She asked May where he went. "He checks the land," May said. "Looks for signs of trespass." Leon lowered her voice. "Does anyone ever come?" May's eyes darkened. "They used to." No more was said. In time, Elijah built a second chicken coop, fixed the western fence, repaired the cracked stovepipe in the root cellar. He spoke few words, but they always landed with quiet certainty. "That tree's dead. Cut it down tomorrow. Snow'll come early next week. Don't leave the feed uncovered." He never raised his voice, never asked for thanks, but the air bent around him. The women moved in accordance with his moods, subtle as tides, and yet, despite the rules, despite the boundaries, he never locked the door. He never told them to stay. He gave them no promises, offered no kindness in words, only space, and that space, safe, unspoken, unyielding, was its own kind of mercy. But the silence lingered. Sometimes in the early morning, Leon would wake to sounds from the barn, not tools, not animals, something else. Metal scraping metal, the creak of old hinges. Once, she thought she heard a voice, a low murmur, not Elijah's, drifting from within. She didn't tell the others. She just watched the barn from the kitchen window while washing dishes, the way one watches the horizon for smoke. And she wondered what could live in a man so tightly shut that even kindness had to be delivered like orders, and what exactly he was trying to keep locked inside. Winter returned like a memory that refused to stay buried, earlier than the women expected, and sharper than it had any right to be. By the end of October, frost clung to the windows each morning, and the chickens huddled in their coop, feathers puffed in tight bundles of warmth and wariness. The wind came down from the northern ridge and screamed through the pines like a widow. It didn't ask permission. It simply came. Elijah rose earlier than usual the day the first snow fell. No words, just the sound of boots on floorboards and the scrape of iron pulled from hooks. He disappeared into the storm with his coat pulled tight and returned, dragging a rusted stove behind him. It took him half the day to install it in the rear corner of the cabin, where the women slept. He didn't explain, just nodded once toward May, then walked out again before the warmth had even begun to fill the room. May watched the stove as if it were a gift too heavy to accept aloud. "He knows cold," she said quietly. "He knows what it takes." The second stove became the heart of the sleeping quarters. Lin brought folded blankets and laid them along the bench nearby. Bao split extra kindling and stacked it like walls beside the door. And Leon, new to this rhythm, still learning, found herself drawn into the current of their preparation. She swept the hearth, then took the broom outside and cleared the porch, not because anyone told her to, but because doing so steadied her hands. That week, Bao taught her the routine of the coop. Chickens needed order. feed at dawn, fresh straw every third day, eggs collected with soft fingers and steady breath. Leon learned which hen pecked hardest, which one liked to perch on the rails, and which one had stopped laying entirely but was still kept around for spirit, as Bao said. There was something sacred in the repetition: scoop, pour, scatter, gather. The birds didn't care who she had been or what she'd lost. They only needed her to show up. Lynn took to sitting beside her during the quiet hours, hands moving with needle and thread. She stitched in small, sharp motions, precise, deliberate. At first, Leon only watched, but then Lynn handed her a square of muslin, already marked with faded lines. A flower. Simple. Leon hesitated. Lynn just nodded. So she tried. Her stitches were crooked, her fingers clumsy, but Lynn didn't correct her. She only watched, then resumed her own sewing with calm acceptance. At night, sleep was no longer a battleground. May brewed a new tea, darker and sweeter than the others, and handed it over with the same sentence each time. This will carry you through the dark. Leon drank it, held the cup until it cooled in her palms, and found that the dreams that followed no longer chased her to waking. No one laughed in the cabin. Not yet. But silence had changed its shape. It no longer pressed down like a hand over the mouth. Now it filled the space between them like shared breath. One night, as the snow piled high against the windows, Leon sat by the stove sewing crooked petals into her fabric. She looked up and saw Bao sharpening her knife, Lynn darning a sleeve, May thumbing through dried herbs. She looked beyond them, toward the closed door, and felt the cold still waiting outside, but she didn't feel afraid. Elijah passed the window then, a dark shape against the snowfall, carrying a sack of feed to the shed. He didn't glance in, didn't knock, but the second stove glowed behind her, steady and warm. Safety, she realized, doesn't come with locks and walls. It comes in the small mercies. A second stove. A shared silence. A woman's voice saying, "This will carry you through." The fire had burned low by the time the others drifted off to their corners of the cabin. Snow tapped softly against the window panes, barely more than a whisper. Leon sat alone on the floor, cross-legged near the hearth, her fingers stained from the day's work. Her needlework rested in a neat pile beside her, unfinished. Sleep wouldn't come. Not tonight. Her mind itched with something nameless. The ashes in the fireplace had settled into a dull gray canvas, soft and waiting. Without thinking, she reached out and drew her fingers through them, slow and careful. First, a round face, then two dark, wide eyes, a hint of a smile, a braid trailing off the edge, faint but clear. A child. Not any child. One from memory. From a time long before the camp, before the cabin. A face she remembered only in moments when everything else fell quiet. She didn't notice the footsteps behind her until they stopped just a pace away. Elijah stood there, boots dusted with snow, hat in one hand. He hadn't knocked. He rarely did. She glanced up quickly, half expecting a scolding for wasting firewood or dirtying the hearth. But he didn't frown. He looked down at the drawing, and something in him shifted. "You draw?" he asked. His voice was different this time. Not cold, not commanding. It was quiet, almost uncertain. Leon nodded slowly, brushing her thumb over the edge of the child's chin, smoothing it into shadow. "Since I was little," she said, "before we left Guangdong. I draw on rice sacks, on anything really. Mama said I saw people how they really were." Elijah crouched beside the hearth, not close, but closer than he'd ever come. He studied the face in the ash as if it were a ghost risen from the coals. His brow tightened. "She looks like someone you lost?" he asked. Leon hesitated. then nodded. A sister, Mei Lin. She died in the river. I was supposed to watch her. I turned away for just a minute. Her voice cracked, not with tears. Those had long since run dry, but with the weight of it, the shape sorrow takes when it's been carried too far without being named. Elijah didn't respond right away. He just stared at the ashes and the drawing within them. Then he reached forward, his hand slow, calloused fingers tracing the air above the image, but never touching it. I had a daughter, he said. Leon blinked. The room fell still. She liked to draw too. Used to scratch stories into the dirt with a stick. Said she was going to write a book one day. Fill it with women who didn't get hurt and men who listened more than they talked. His hand dropped to his knee. She died in fire, he added, matter of fact, like saying it plain made it bearable. They sat like that for a long time, the fire muttering softly behind them. The child's face in the ashes remained untouched, fragile, temporary, but seen. Elijah stood finally, joints creaking. He didn't say anything more, but he didn't look away from her either. And as he turned and walked back toward his corner of the cabin, Leon felt something leave the room with him. Not anger, not pain, but a piece of silence that had lingered too long. She looked back at the drawing, then let her hand sweep gently across it, erasing the face until only soft dust remained. Some things didn't need to stay. Some things only needed to be witnessed. The morning light had not yet stretched across the valley when Leon rose from her cot. The cabin still slept, May's soft breath steady beside the stove. Lynn curled beneath her quilt, Bow's boots resting by the door like sentries at ease. But Leon felt pulled by something, quiet and wordless, like the feeling before rain. She slipped outside, wrapping herself in the wool shawl Lynn had mended just days before. The snow was thin this morning, clinging only to the shadows beneath the trees. The air smelled of thawing earth and old wood smoke. Ahead of her, through the skeletal apple trees that crowned the western slope of the land, she saw Elijah. He moved slower in the mornings now, his breath visible in clouds as he walked past the coop, past the edge of the split-rail fence, down toward the part of the orchard no one ever spoke of. She followed without thinking, her feet finding the places his boots had already broken the frost. He didn't look back. He never did. But when he stopped beneath one of the apple trees, bare, its bark pale and blistered by years of cold, he knelt, not to clear snow or chop branches, just knelt. Leon stopped just beyond the final tree, still half hidden. The sun broke then, a thin light spilling through the clouds and catching the edge of a small wooden cross, half swallowed by the ground. The grave was unmarked save for the cross. No name, no date. Only a curl of iron nailed to the center where something must have once been carved, now worn smooth by wind and time. Elijah took off his hat. He held it in his hands, fingers pressed against the crown. His head bowed. Not in prayer, exactly, but in something close. He didn't speak, yet the silence around him felt heavy with words unsaid, like this was a conversation he'd had many times, without reply. Leon watched as he reached into his coat and drew out a small cloth bundle. He unfolded it slowly. Inside was a child's ribbon, faded blue, frayed at the edges. He laid it at the foot of the grave with the kind of care that made Leon's throat tighten. Then he stood, slowly, like the weight he carried was heavier than his frame could bear. Without glancing back, he returned the way he came, passing within a few feet of where Leon stood behind the tree. He did not stop, but as he passed, he said quietly, "Don't come here unless you need to remember someone." Leon didn't follow, not right away. She waited until he disappeared over the rise, then stepped closer to the grave. She knelt where he had been and touched the frost-covered ribbon. It was stiff with age, still holding on. Later that day, when the sun was high and the fire had begun its afternoon crackle, she found May steeping herbs in the kitchen. The scent of mint and ginger hung in the air. Leon didn't speak at first, but May looked at her, eyes knowing, and said, "You saw it." Leon nodded. "Whose grave?" May stirred the pot slowly. "His wife and his little girl. They died the year before we came. Railroad men wanted this ridge, said the cabin stood in their way. He wouldn't sell, so they waited until he was away. Burned it down with them still inside." Leon's hand trembled around the teacup. May continued, her voice low and steady. "He buried them with his own hands, rebuilt the cabin with wood from the trees that watched it burn." Silence fell again, the kind that asked for nothing but presence. May placed a gentle hand on Leon's. "That's the kind of man who took us in." And for the first time, Leon understood the sharpness in Elijah's eyes, the way he watched the barn, the gate, the women, the way he moved like he owed the dead something only the living could repay. He had built this place not for shelter, but for penance. And now, maybe, for something more. They came just after the midday meal, their arrival announced not by sound, but by the sudden stillness that fell across the homestead. The chickens hushed, the wind shifted, even the fire inside the cabin seemed to quiet. Leon stood by the wash basin when she saw them through the window. 3 men on horseback, all in black coats, their boots dusted with snow, their faces sharp and pale beneath flat-brimmed hats. The kind of men who didn't ask for directions, the kind who came knowing exactly where they were headed and why. By the time she stepped outside, Elijah was already there. He stood at the edge of the front path. His sleeves rolled, axe still in hand from the morning's woodcutting. He didn't move forward, didn't speak, just watched. The man in the center dismounted first. He wore a vest of polished leather, a silver chain glinting from his pocket. He removed his gloves slowly, like a man used to being watched. "Afternoon," he said. "You Elijah Crane?" Elijah nodded once. The man smiled thinly. "Name's Pierce. I represent the Kingswell Railroad Company. Fine operation. Big reach. We're surveying the region for expansion. This ridge happens to fall within our route map. Now, we've looked over some old deeds, and we're seeing irregularities. Seems this parcel may not be lawfully claimed." Elijah said nothing. Pierce glanced around. "Hell of a place, remote. Hard living, I'd imagine. You keeping livestock?" A second man, wiry and twitchy, stepped closer to the porch. His eyes landed on the cabin window where Bao now stood, arms crossed, unmoving. Lynn stepped beside her. May remained seated, visible behind the curtain, stirring something at the stove, as if the presence of strangers did not alter the shape of her afternoon. Pierce's voice shifted. "You've taken in help, I see. Unusual arrangement. These women, yours?" Elijah's jaw tensed. "They're not yours to ask about." The third man, younger, scoffed. "Pretty bold, talking like that, old man. They speak English?" Bao opened the door just enough to step outside. Her voice was flat and clear. "We understand you just fine." Pierce's smile sharpened. "That's so? Well, let me be plain then. The company wants this land. You're not properly deeded. No records filed in the last 8 years. We could push this through court, but that's slow, expensive. We're offering you a way out. Sell and walk. No trouble." Elijah stared at him, then at the horses, then back. "This land's not for sale," he said. Pierce sighed, as if disappointed in a stubborn child. We're offering a generous sum considering— And neither are people, Elijah added, his voice steady as iron. The wind picked up again. The third man reached for something beneath his coat, but Elijah's axe shifted slightly in his grip. Not raised, just enough to remind. Pierce held up a hand to stop the motion. He stepped back toward his horse. We'll return in a week. Think it over. I've thought it over, Elijah said. The three men mounted. As they turned to leave, the twitchy one spat into the dirt, his eyes lingering too long on Lynn. Then they rode off, slow enough to show they weren't afraid, but not slow enough to hide they were watching. When the sound of hooves faded into the trees, Elijah turned and set the axe down beside the porch. Bao looked at him. They'll come back, she said. He nodded. Let them. Leon stood at the doorway, watching the path the men had taken, her heart thudding like it had back in the camp. But something was different now. The fear was still there, but so was something else. A line drawn in the snow, and a man who had chosen his side. It began in the dry goods store, as such things often do, in a hush of half-truths wrapped in brown paper, and passed from one cautious mouth to another. Mrs. Daltrey, the banker's wife, said she'd heard it from her cousin's boy, who worked up near the timber road. He said he'd seen them with his own eyes. 3 Chinese women living up on Hollow Ridge, out there with the old mountain man who never came to town unless someone was bleeding or dead. Said they weren't kin. Said they weren't hired hands either. By midweek, the talk had spread to the church steps. At first it was only whispered, between women folding hymnals and men hitching wagons. But then it found its way into the mouth of someone who'd make it carry, Mrs. Whitlock, the preacher's wife. She stood up during the Thursday ladies' meeting, her voice high and polished like porcelain. There are women up there, foreign, alone, with no papers, no families, no oversight, under the roof of a man like that. Her words dangled just long enough to cast their own shape in the silence. If we say nothing, are we not complicit? Someone murmured, He's never done harm. But the seed had already been planted. Mrs. Whitlock smiled. Goodness must be protected, yes, but so must decency. And so the rumors grew legs. Men in the barber shop talked about land claims and law. Women whispered about trafficking and sin. Children passed stories they didn't understand, about ghosts in the woods and wild women with snake eyes. One old man on the corner swore the mountain man had once killed a sheriff and buried him under the orchard. No one questioned it too hard, but not everyone swallowed the tale. Hester Riley, midwife of 30 winters and friend to both cradle and grave, heard the whispers and shook her head. She had delivered half the town, seen more pain and truth in her hands than most saw in a lifetime, and she knew the shape of a lie when it dressed itself up as concern. They speak like they know, she muttered, stirring willow bark tea in her tiny kitchen, but they've never climbed that mountain, never met those women. Her niece Alma said softly, Why do you care, Aunt Hester? They're strangers. Hester looked up from her cup. Because once, not so long ago, I was a stranger, and I remember who came to my door and who turned their eyes away. The next morning, Hester hitched her mare, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and rode toward Hollow Ridge. She didn't ask for company. She didn't announce her visit. She simply went. The trail was half melted from the early thaw, and the wind was sharp, but she rode steady, eyes forward. By midday, she spotted the smoke from Elijah's chimney, curling like a ribbon into the pale sky. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped her horse and sat a long moment, watching. No sounds of distress, no shadows at the windows, just a small homestead standing quiet in the cold, guarded not by guns but by distance. Then the cabin door opened. One of the women stepped out, May, though Hester did not yet know her name. She did not speak, but her eyes met Hester's, and they held no fear. Hester nodded once, then climbed down from her horse. Sometimes truth needed to be seen with one's own eyes, and Hester Riley had never trusted second-hand stories. The knock was light but firm, like a woman who didn't need to be invited to know she had the right to be there. Elijah opened the door, axe in hand, but when he saw Hester Riley standing on his porch, wrapped in a dark shawl, her gray braid tucked behind one shoulder, he said nothing, only lowered the axe and stepped aside. She entered like she'd walked into hundreds of homes before, and she had. She took in the room with the kind of eyes that saw more in one glance than most could in an hour. The worn quilts, the patched skirts hung to dry, the scent of tea and boiled herbs, the tidy hearth and the second stove burning low. She saw the three women seated around the table, their hands stilling the moment she crossed the threshold. They didn't rise, but they didn't shrink either. She looked at each of them. May met her gaze with a healer's calm. Lynn, silent and watchful, didn't flinch. Bao kept her shoulders back, her eyes hard, like someone ready to be struck and not break. Leon stood half-shadowed in the kitchen, unsure whether to flee or step forward. Hester removed her gloves, then sat in the nearest chair. No words. Just the hiss of fire and the low creak of wind through the roof beams. Elijah remained near the door, arms folded, watching like a man ready to defend what couldn't be explained. The weight in the room wasn't anger. It was something older, tested, fragile. Hester finally spoke, her voice a steady gravel softened by years and birthbeds and funerals. They say you're hiding things here. Women, secrets, trouble. No one answered. She looked around again. I see herbs drying by the window. That's not trouble. I see thread and cloth. That's not secrets. I see a young girl whose eyes have seen too much. That's not something to hide. She looked at Elijah now. I see a man who doesn't talk unless it matters, and whose hands built a space where 4 women feel safe enough to sit in peace, even when the town spits at their names. Still, no one spoke, not because they couldn't, but because the silence spoke better. Hester nodded, like a judgment had been made in her bones. You built something here. I don't know what all of it means. Don't have to, but I can see what it is. It's good. May's lips parted slightly, not quite a smile, but not fear either. Hester turned to the women now, her words gentle but firm. Goodness don't need words, but it does need defending. She rose, slow but steady, and placed a hand on Leon's shoulder as she passed. They'll come back, with louder voices, sharper ones. Be ready, but don't let them make you small. She reached the door, paused, then looked at Elijah again. I'll tell them what I saw here, she said. Not the ones who want to burn it down, the ones still deciding, the ones who remember what right looks like. He gave a single nod. It was all he had to give. She left without asking for tea or kindness. She didn't need it. She had already taken what she came for. And left behind something stronger than permission. She had named what she saw. And now, someone besides the 4 of them would carry the truth down that mountain. It was Bao who found the loose board, though she wasn't looking for anything but a place to hide a pouch of dried meat from the winter rats. Her heel caught the edge of a warped plank beneath the cot where Lynn slept, and when she pried it back with a knife, she saw the thin crack of an old envelope shoved deep into the dark. Something's in here, she said. They gathered slowly, unsure. Leon fetched a candle, and May reached into the space with careful fingers. What she pulled out was brittle with age, a wax-sealed envelope, yellowed, the seal broken long ago but still clinging to the crease like a final breath. Inside were folded papers, dry and faded but clear. Her hands trembled as she laid them across the table and smoothed them flat. The fire crackled as they read. A deed, handwritten, with ink that had not yet bled away. Surveyor's marks, coordinates, boundaries, the name at the bottom, Elijah Crane. Dated, signed, witnessed. It was official, not fancy, but real, legal. May looked to Elijah, who stood by the door with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. He shrugged. "Didn't figure I'd need it again. When they burned it all down, most of the records with it, I thought words wouldn't matter." Bao leaned closer, tapping the page. "But it's still here. You kept it." Elijah didn't answer. Leon lifted the paper with reverence. "This could stop them, couldn't it? Prove the land's yours." Elijah gave a slow nod, eyes fixed on the flame. "If someone's willing to see it." May folded the deed and slid it back into the envelope. "Then we show someone who will." That someone was Hester. The next morning, she rode down the mountain with the envelope tucked beneath her shawl. Her horse moved quick and sure, hooves slicing through the half-melted snow as if they knew time had thinned. In town, she marched straight into the county office, not bothering with pleasantries. Thomas Langley sat behind the desk, county recorder, mild-mannered, always looking like he wished he'd chosen a quieter profession. Hester laid the papers before him without flourish. "Old deed," she said. "Signed proper. Name's Elijah Crane. That land they're trying to steal, he's got claim. Always did." Langley adjusted his glasses, looked it over, and nodded. "Looks real. I'll log it." But by the next morning, something had shifted. When Hester returned to ask for a copy, Langley looked pale. He avoided her eyes. "There's an issue," he said. "Missing supplementary filings. The original claim might have lapsed. I need to verify with the district office." Hester's eyes narrowed. "You're stalling." He swallowed. "I'm following procedure." She left without another word. That evening, a stable boy whispered what he'd seen. Mr. Pierce, one of the black-coated men, had slipped into Langley's office after sunset. No papers, no arguments, just a handshake, a small leather pouch passed across the desk, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. By dawn, the town knew. The deed existed, but it didn't matter. Not when gold was heavier than justice. Elijah said nothing when Hester returned with the news. He only took the envelope, placed it gently back beneath the floorboard, and nailed it shut. "The law's not on our side," May said quietly. "No," Elijah replied. "But the truth still is." Outside, the wind picked up again, the kind that didn't blow long, but always came before something bigger. The smell of smoke came first, faint, acrid, threading through the cold night air like a warning no one had asked for. Leon stirred from her cot before the shout came. She sat upright, heart thudding, before she even understood why. Then the crack of splintering wood ripped through the silence. "Elijah!" Bao's voice rang out from the porch. By the time Leon reached the door, the barn was already ablaze. The fire had taken root fast, climbing the outer wall like a living thing. Flames licked up toward the rafters, casting monstrous shadows across the snow. Sparks flew high, catching in the limbs of the leafless orchard, and the chickens shrieked from their coop. Elijah was already there. He moved like a man who'd done this before, who knew the language of panic, but wouldn't speak it. He ripped open the barn door with one shoulder, vanishing into the black smoke without a word. Lynn cried out and ran to fill buckets from the pump. Bao grabbed a blanket and beat at the creeping grass fire near the fence. Leon stood frozen, the heat hitting her face even from yards away. Then she ran. Inside the barn, the air was thick and hot, the smell of burning hay and fear choking the space. Elijah emerged with 2 goats roped together, their legs buckling beneath them. He shoved them out and turned back in, coughing hard. Leon ran to help the goats clear the path, then turned just in time to see him reappear again, this time dragging a water barrel toward a burning stall. The horses were still inside. "Elijah, stop!" she cried, but he didn't. He vanished once more into the blaze. When he returned, the horses thundered out behind him, wild-eyed and screaming. But Elijah staggered, one hand pressed to his side, his coat burned through, face slick with sweat and soot. He dropped to one knee. Leon was there in an instant. She grabbed his arm. "Come on!" He shook his head. "Get the gate." "Bow has it," she snapped. "You're done." She half dragged, half led him away from the barn as it groaned under the weight of the fire. The roof finally gave with a thunderous crash, sending embers flying like angry stars into the night. Later, in the quiet of the cabin, she sat him down by the stove. His shirt was burned across his ribs, skin blistered and raw. May prepared a salve in silence while Lynn laid out bandages. Leon knelt beside him, wringing a cloth in cool water. "You should have let it burn," she whispered as she cleaned the soot from his brow. Elijah winced, but didn't answer. Leon's hand trembled as she pressed a wet cloth to the scorched skin along his side. "They already took your family." He looked at her then, really looked, his eyes tired but sharp. "They won't take us," she said. Her voice didn't shake. He nodded once. Not again. No one spoke after that. There was only the soft hiss of the ointment being stirred, the gentle rustle of bough outside patrolling the dark, and the slow, steady breathing of the man who had once lost everything, now surrounded by the ones he was willing to burn for. The barn smoldered through the night, but the house stood. The animals lived, and the line had been drawn not in ash, but in resolve. By morning, the smoke could still be seen rising over Hollow Ridge, a thin gray ribbon stretching toward the pale sky. In town, it didn't take long for the news to reach every corner, from the post office to the mill yard, from the saloon to the church pews. No one needed to ask what had happened. Everyone already knew. Fire didn't set itself in a barn that stood for 20 winters without someone striking the match. In the general store, Mr. Hanley spoke first. He was warned. Should have sold when he had the chance. Beside the pickle barrels, young Thomas Riley, the blacksmith's boy, shook his head. They tried to kill his animals, maybe him too. "That's not a negotiation. That's war." At the churchyard, Mrs. Whitlock clutched her shawl and sniffed toward the group gathered near the gate. "I warned you all. That mountain man, he's inviting ruin. Foreigners, fire, now division. What's next? Guns in the street?" But Hester stood nearby, hands folded over her cane, and her voice rang clear. "You speak of ruin like it came from them. I went to that cabin. I saw decency. I saw courage, the kind that this town's forgotten how to recognize." Murmurs broke out. A few heads nodded. Others turned away. The mayor called a meeting for the next night in the town hall. Said it was time to bring the matter to light, before it brought the whole valley down with it. By the time evening fell, the hall was packed. Lanterns swung from the rafters. Coats dripped snow by the door. Elijah didn't come. Neither did the women. But Hester stood near the front, shawl tight, eyes sharper than any judge's. The mayor opened with a cough, adjusting his spectacles. "There's concern," he said, "about the conflict brewing on Hollow Ridge. Claims of ownership, safety, the railroad's expansion, and noun, this fire." Pierce was there too, his black coat buttoned to the chin, voice smooth. The company has invested heavily in this region. Prosperity is coming, but only if we clear the path. That ridge is a key route. We've offered Mr. Crane every chance to move peaceably. Peaceably? Someone shouted. You set fire to his barn. We've done no such thing, Pierce replied calmly. And there's no proof otherwise. Hester stepped forward then, her cane thudding once against the wooden floor. You speak of investment. But I've seen what Elijah built. Not just a cabin, a refuge, for women who had nowhere else to go, for lives you would have tossed aside like spoiled fruit. Mrs. Whitlock stood, her voice shrill. He's keeping women up there like property. They are no man's property, Hester said. They are safer there than anywhere this town ever offered them. The room roiled, arguments flared, voices rising. Some shouted for law, others for justice. Farmers spoke of tradition. Young men spoke of jobs promised by the rail. But the undercurrent had shifted. The gossip had grown roots, tangled now with conscience. At the edge of the room, the preacher's daughter whispered, I heard one of the women sings in her sleep. My sister says she dreams of teaching little ones, if she's ever safe again. A silence followed that. The mayor called for calm. We'll reconvene tomorrow. Marshall's coming up from Helena. Let him decide what law applies. People filtered out into the cold, their boots crunching over frozen mud. But the town was not as it had been. It had split. Not cleanly, not neatly, but down a line as old as the land itself, between those who feared what they didn't understand and those who had finally seen it for what it was, humanity, bruised but standing, asking only to be left in peace. Snow fell steadily on the morning they returned. The sky hung low, heavy with silence, the kind that made even birds hold their breath. At the edge of the property, 3 riders emerged from the trees, black coats flapping like flags in the wind. Their horses moved slow, deliberate, hooves crunching through the frozen crust of yesterday's melt. This time, they weren't alone. Behind them came 2 more, rifles strapped to their saddles, faces hard, eyes hidden beneath wide brims. Pierce dismounted first, his boots pressing sharp prints into the snow. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He walked straight toward the cabin, clutching a rolled bundle of papers in his gloved hand. Elijah Crane, he called, voice slicing through the air like a whip. You've had your warnings. This land no longer belongs to you. We have documents proving as much. Elijah stepped out from the side of the house. No coat this time, just his thick flannel, sleeves rolled, his body stiff with pain from the fire but steady. He didn't speak. Beside him stood Bow, silent and unflinching, her axe slung across her back. Lynn lingered in the doorway, one hand on Leon's shoulder. May stood at the corner, eyes sharp, holding nothing but calm. Pierce smirked. You gonna fight this out here? With firewood and silence? Law's not on your side, old man. Not anymore. Before Elijah could answer, the sound of wagon wheels cracked through the quiet. From the east path came a line of townsfolk, 6 wagons, men and women on horseback, a handful on foot. They came with shovels, pitchforks, even a few rifles. The blacksmith rode near the front, his arm in a sling. The preacher came on an old mule, Bible in one hand, eyes stern beneath his hat. And Hester Riley sat upright on her mare, a satchel tucked beneath her arm, her mouth set like stone. The riders reined in beside the homestead, dismounting slow. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Pierce looked around, less sure now. This is trespass, he snapped. Interference with federal property. The only thing federal about this, Hester said, swinging down from her saddle, is this deed. She opened the satchel and produced the envelope, holding it high in one gloved hand. Signed by hand, Filed proper before the fire. Witnessed and dated. It's his. Pierce's lip curled. It's void. The recorder rejected it. A new voice spoke then, calm and firm. That's not his call. From behind the crowd, a man on a black horse rode into view. A long coat with a silver star at the breast caught the morning light. He swung down, removed his gloves, and stepped between the groups. Marshal Langdon. Out of Helena, he said, his voice plain as gravel. I've seen the telegraph, and I've seen the documents. He turned to Hester, who handed him the deed. He unfolded it, read, and nodded. Legit, he said. This land belongs to Elijah Crane. Pierce's men shifted in their saddles, uneasy. One reached for his rifle, but the blacksmith raised his own, leveled and ready. Bow stepped forward, her axe now in hand. The marshal raised a hand. No one's dying today. But if any of you raise a weapon again, I'll see you in irons before sundown. Pierce's face twisted with rage. You have no idea who we work for. The marshal turned to him. And you seem to have forgotten what law means. A long silence followed. Snowflakes landed softly on rifle barrels and leather gloves. Then, one by one, the railroad men backed their horses away, Pierce the last to turn. As he rode off, he spat in the snow, a dark blot on the white. The townsfolk stood still a moment longer. Then the preacher said, It's done. Not a cheer, not a clap. Just nods, just breath, just the quiet satisfaction of right being named. The ridge held firm. The cabin stood. And this time, justice had not arrived too late. The next morning, the sky dawned pale and wide. The kind of cold blue that made the trees crack and the frost cling to fence posts like lace. The valley was quiet, but it was not calm. Not yet. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and steady. Outside, townsfolk gathered in tight clusters, their breath fogging the air, their boots stamping the cold from their toes. The U.S. Marshal sat at Elijah's table, his hat resting on one knee, the deed and a stack of crumpled papers spread before him like puzzle pieces needing solving. He read each slowly, lips moving silently, eyes narrowing. The women stood nearby, silent but alert. Elijah leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, saying nothing. Hester watched from the hearth, her hands folded over her cane. The room felt heavy with something about to shift. Marshal Langdon lifted one of the documents, the one Pierce had thrust forward the day before. This here, he said, holding it up to the light, claims the land's been dormant, tax defaulted, and unclaimed for over 8 years, filed by one Jeremiah Holt. He turned to Elijah. You ever hear that name? Elijah shook his head once. The marshal nodded. Didn't think so. He pulled out another sheet. This one's signed by a county recorder, Langley down in town. Hester snorted. Spineless man. Langdon didn't smile. He turned the paper around, tapped it. Except this signature here. Don't match any filing from the last 10 years. Ink's wrong. Seal's wrong. And this paper? Fresh stock. Just ordered last month. Same batch used by the railroad office. He turned to the group assembled just outside the cabin door, his voice carrying now, steady and cold. These papers are forgeries. Someone lied. Someone broke the law. A rustle moved through the crowd. Then, without a word, one of the men in the black coats, Riley the younger one, bolted. He turned, ran for his horse, boots sliding in the snow. But he didn't get far. The blacksmith stepped in his path. Bow was behind him, and the marshal didn't even flinch. Riley Bourne, Langdon called. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted seizure of property through forged federal documentation. The man stopped, his face pale. 2 of Langdon's deputies closed in. Pierce stood a few feet away, jaw clenched, eyes hollow. "I didn't write the papers," he muttered. "I was just following orders." The marshal looked at him, long and steady. "You knew what you were doing. That's enough." He motioned again. Another arrest. Another set of irons. May stepped forward, her voice calm. "Will that be enough to stop them?" "The railroad?" Langdon looked to her. "No, but it's a start." He turned to the crowd now, his voice rising just enough to be heard by all. "Justice ain't loud," he said. "It don't shout and it don't run. It waits, it watches, and when it comes, it don't ask permission." He looked back to Elijah. "You did right, Crane. You stood when most would have folded." Elijah didn't speak. He didn't need to. The marshal tipped his hat, tucked the real deed into his coat, and turned to go. And as the arrested men were led down the slope, boots crunching, arms bound, the snow began to fall again. Soft, slow, cleansing. Not everything was fixed. Not everything would be. But the truth had been pulled from the earth like a buried root, exposed to the cold light of day. And that, for now, was enough. Spring came slow, like an old dog returning to a place it once loved but no longer trusted. The last of the snow clung to the shadowed edges of the orchard, and the stream behind the barn, now rebuilt with hands from town, ran fat and fast with meltwater. The wind no longer cut to the bone. It whispered instead, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine needles, of beginnings not yet spoken aloud. Elijah stood near the fence, one boot braced on the lower rail, watching as Leon knelt in the mud. She pressed her hands into the soil the way others might press them into Scripture, deliberate, reverent. Her fingers moved carefully, planting the seedling May had helped her sprout in the windowsill jars. Tomato, squash, beans, a crooked row of hope. Behind her, Lynn knelt too, placing wooden markers into the ground, each one etched with characters that only she and Leon could read. She didn't speak, but as the sun warmed their backs and the soil stained their palms, a low hum slipped from her lips, a melody with no words, but all meaning. The garden stretched out along the cabin's southern edge, where the light lingered longest. A space that had once held only silence and snow now pulsed with green beginnings. Each stem, each leaf, a defiance against what had been. Inside, May laughed. It was a sound no one recognized at first, sharp, sudden, full of surprise. Leon looked up from the dirt and saw Bao leaning back in a chair, trying to catch a falling jar that Lynn had placed too close to the edge. The jar tumbled, cracked, and instead of scolding, May burst into laughter. A real one, like the bark of a crow startled from a tree. Bao laughed next, gruff and half shocked by the sound of herself doing it. Leon blinked and smiled. Later that afternoon, she took out her paints, colors she'd begged from the general store, traded for with embroidered patches Lynn had sewn and jam May had brewed from the frozen berries that had survived the edge of winter. She mixed them with ash and oil and old egg yolks until they gleamed like polished stone. She chose the cabin's east wall, the one that faced the rising sun. With a brush carved from a pine twig and old horsehair, she began to paint. It started with flame, not fire that devours, but fire that cleanses, that leaves behind the soil from which something new might rise. Then came wings, 3 of them, phoenixes. One bold and fierce, red gold and rising, one smaller, curved in flight, one half-shadowed but steady. She did not name them. But Elijah stood watching as the shapes took form, his arms crossed. At some point, without a word, he stepped forward, knelt beside her, and picked up a second brush. His hands were too big for the delicate work, and the lines he painted were thick, unsure. but they were placed with care. He painted the fourth bird, smaller than the rest, rising a little slower, its wings just beginning to open. Leon paused, eyes stinging. "That one's yours?" Elijah didn't answer, just kept painting. And as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, casting long gold shadows across the garden, the cabin no longer looked like a shelter built by a man hiding from the world. It looked like a place people had chosen to stay, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they were finally, truly, home. The new barn rose slowly, beam by beam, timber cut and hauled from the western edge of the ridge where the pines grew straight and tall. Elijah worked with quiet determination, his hands blackened with pitch and calloused anew by the labor. But this time, he wasn't alone. The blacksmith's boy helped lift the frame. Hester brought coffee and salted bread. The preacher loaned his wagon and mule for the hauling, and even Thomas Langley, the once timid county recorder, stood awkwardly with hammer in hand, eager to nail something right for once in his life. It wasn't loud work. There were no boasts, no songs, no shouted commands, just the rhythm of nails driving into wood, the creak of ropes tightening, the steady scrape of saw against plank. Townsfolk came and went in pairs, offering what they could, tools, time, hands. No one asked for thanks, and none was needed. The barn took shape beneath a sky that had turned from gray to soft blue, the wind smelling of sun-warmed grass and last year's leaves. Where Shar had once blackened the soil, fresh boards now stood, golden and strong. It was the same footprint as before, but taller now, brighter, like the land itself had decided to forget the fire. Inside the cabin, the women prepared stew. Leon sliced carrots while May kneaded dough for the hearth oven. Lynn embroidered new curtains from a length of pale linen, and Bao returned from town with hinges and oil, her eyes no longer scanning the tree line with suspicion. They weren't visitors anymore. They didn't speak of leaving, not even in whispers. Their things, once kept in bundles, now lived on shelves, tucked into drawers, hung from walls with care. The cabin no longer felt like Elijah's home that others passed through. It felt like all of theirs. That evening, the barn doors swung open for the first time. Inside, fresh hay had been stacked high. The horses stood calm in their stalls. The goats settled easily, as if remembering the place by scent. The hens clucked in their roosts, the rhythm of life already taking hold. Elijah stood outside the threshold, wiping his hands with an oilcloth. The light of dusk bathed the clearing in amber. Leon approached, holding a small carved figure, a phoenix, wings spread wide. She had whittled it from scrap wood and painted it with soot and dried berries. "For the barn," she said, placing it in his palm. He looked at it for a long moment, then at her. "You're safe here now," he said, his voice low but sure. "You ain't got to run again." She nodded, the words sinking into her chest like roots. Behind them, Bao and Lynn emerged from the cabin, followed by May, drying her hands on a linen cloth. They stood together without speaking, just watching the barn as the first stars blinked awake above the valley. A breeze stirred, warm and gentle. From the high branches of the orchard trees, birds took flight, small ones, swift and light, weaving together across the sky like threads in a tapestry. They rose higher and higher, silhouettes painted against the last glow of day, circling once above the cabin, then gliding westward toward the distant ridge. The camera pulls back slowly. The clearing grows smaller, the cabin tucked into the arms of the mountain, the garden blooming at its feet, the smoke from the chimney rising soft and steady. And then the screen fades to black.